everybody. Welcome to Daniel Davis Deep Dive, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. We have got a really good show for you today, and we've got somebody that you're going to be really grateful to hear, and that is George Beebe, who is a former CIA analyst, a lead guy on the Russia channel, the Russia department at the CIA, currently the director of grand strategy at Quincy Institute, and has recently published an article on the Russia-Ukraine war, which you're going to get to here shortly. But man, you've been really prescient, George, and a lot of things going on there. And I think your background at the CIA, we're in a real treat to hear from you today. And welcome to our show.
Great. Well, thanks, Danny. It's a real honor to be with you.
Listen, I've had the privilege of sharing a stage with you a few times at some conferences we've been to, and certainly I've been following your written career and things that you've been publishing. We look at that a lot, actually. And so specifically here, I want to talk about, we're going to get to here in just a second, about where this war is, where it's going, and how much of a difference it could it make if the Ukraine gets the money from the United States and the European Union that they're seeking right now, or is the war? Are there other fundamentals that are going to dictate the outcome? Now, spoiler alert, we've been talking on this channel quite a bit that it's really not about money, but about men. It's not even about machines. It's about men. And that's what eventually fights and wins or loses wars. And I think that, we've seen so far that all the money that we've given, all the machines haven't changed the outcome, because it can't change the fact about the men and the number of people that they've lost, et cetera. But you have some pretty prescient information here that are views that you've shared, which if had been listened to a year ago, things could have been very different. But first, I want to lay out for our audience here what the status is right here. So first of all, now we know that President Biden has been asking for a lot of money here for a while for Ukraine. And he said in early December, which we may look at here shortly, that it's a huge, important issue that we give the money. Well, John Kirby said just a few days back, but that money is running out.
Military assistance to Ukraine? I mean, has the well really run dry here, or what does it look like?
We have issued the last drawdown package that we had funding to support, and that's why it's critical that Congress move on that national security supplemental request and we get more funding. The assistance that we provided has now ground to a halt. The attacks that the Russians are conducting are only increasing. And now, as I talked about earlier this week, they're using North Korean ballistic missiles to do their dirty work. So the need is acute right now.
Zelensky, on the other hand, doesn't seem to be concerned about this. And in fact, he's still plunging through, fully expecting to win.
I am grateful to every leader and every country that takes part in this joint work of ours and confirms by their participation that the rules-based world order must be restored for everyone on Earth without exception. Ukrainian initiatives are gradually becoming global initiatives. I am grateful to everyone who helps us with this. Month after month, we are ramping up our Ukrainian artillery production. Ukraine has sufficient potential to make it through this difficult path of war. We have the potential to rally the world. We have the potential to win. The key is to believe in ourselves, to believe in Ukraine.
He's saying the key is to believe in Ukraine. You just got to believe. I mean, it almost sounds like some of those Christmas movies I have. You just got to believe, and then bam, it'll be able to work, and forget about all the things that have happened there. But his appeal apparently is not falling on deaf ears, because I believe it's the Swiss foreign minister seems to concur.
We have to give a future. We need to give hope. And we have to encourage the Ukrainian population to imagine their future. That it is our duty, and it is our interest to do this, because if they lose hope, they're no longer going to fight. If they're no longer going to fight, the geopolitical consequences will be major. And they are not in our interest. So there's a real spin behind this.
Now, here's my problem with a lot of that, George, is that they're really putting a lot of emphasis on you just got to believe, and you can't let them go. We can't let Russia win because it would be bad geopolitically. President Biden's going to say the same thing in a clip we're going to show here in a little bit, that there's lots of consequences if it doesn't. But what that kind of avoids is the fact of what's going on the ground truth reality. Now, we can look, first of all, just at kind of the operational view is that in the past, now well over a year, that front line has not moved. Since November of 2022, the front line has basically stayed pretty static. So all the stuff that we did to try to find an offensive capacity for Ukraine, to help them take back their land and to go to the Sea of Azov and all that, that didn't happen. But now let me show you the evidence on the current tactical battlefront that kind of paints a similar picture.
Russians, they're not stupid as you can read on social medias and all of these memes. They're learning, and they are a professional army. And now one of the biggest threat is FPV kamikaze drone with artificial intelligence. So that's why all of our last requests are drone jammers and anti-drone rifles. They're saying it's a new phase of the war. Also, we've got a list of requests to soldiers to Robotyne area, to Avdiivka, to Bakhmut, Kupiansk.
Now that's an aid worker, a Ukrainian aid worker who's trying to get stuff released for their country, and you see he's just listing out all the names of these villages: Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Kupiansk, all these places where Russia is methodically and slowly moving to the west, and Ukraine is not on the march anywhere, of course. And to really drive home his comments about the drones and the impact that has on the actual line of contact, we interviewed a week or so ago an American volunteer who was fighting for the Ukraine on those very front lines, and here's what he had to say about the drones.
The drone warfare has made it very difficult to leave a trench dugout on either side of the war. The Russians have largely caught up to us and maybe surpassed us in some ways with drone warfare. Do you hear the noise? It sounds like a mosquito in your ear, and that's a drone coming. So at least you can hear them most of the time, and they're being used to drop grenades. It certainly has changed war. I mean, there's no real way to advance when you can't step out of the dugout even to take a leak without risk of dying from a grenade coming from the sky.
Man, that was so painful to hear, George, when these guys, like, they literally can't even get out of their dugout without worrying about the drones. And of course, that doesn't even talk about the artillery, the rocket fire, the ATGMs, anti-tank guided missiles, and all the kinds of other things, or the infantrymen on the Russian side. But all of these things you see paint a consistent picture that on the battlefield, it doesn't matter what anybody thinks in Brussels or in Washington or in Kiev. If you can't win on the line of contact, then it doesn't matter how much money you're going to give.
No, I think that's exactly right. And you haven't mentioned what I regard as one of the biggest challenges that the Ukrainians have, and that's in air defense. You know, on paper, from the very start of this war, the Russians have had, great advantages of their air force over Ukraine's. They have multiple times the number of aircraft that they could bring to bear. For most of this war, they haven't used that air capability very effectively, in part because they were worried that Ukrainian air defenses that were supported by the United States, supported by NATO, would shoot down the Russian aircraft. And so they didn't really use them very much, and certainly not very aggressively. There was not the kind of close air support that the Russians, in theory, might have been able to do to back up their ground forces. But that is now changing. I think the Ukrainians are clearly running short of air defense capabilities, and their ability to defend against Russian air attacks, both from fixed-wing aircraft and from missiles and drones, is diminishing quite significantly. And I think that has enormous implications for how this war could continue.
But plus you just get to factor in the whole thing that we saw, one of the primary reasons for the lack of success. There was actually a number of them, but the key thing is that Russia had dug so much defenses and their mine laying equipment and their fortifications that they had built over many belts and very depth with all kinds of artillery coverage, direct fire systems coverage, all the key things, the fundamentals things that you do in the defense. Ukraine has no answer for it because they don't have mine clearing capacities. They don't have the experience, and they certainly don't have enough trained men and equipment to be able to penetrate those mines outside of what you just meant about the area issue.
No, that's right. Which means effectively that Ukraine's strategy for this war, a strategy that the United States has supported, which is going on the offense, breaking through Russian lines, taking advantage of the ability to concentrate forces and achieve tactical surprise, break through the Russian lines, and in so doing, force the Russians to make a painful decision. Either they call for a ceasefire or they see continued Ukrainian advances. That has been Ukraine's strategy. That can't work. I think right now, what we're seeing with the failure of the counteroffensive this past year and the correlation of forces that you've described here, both in terms of equipment and ammunition and even more important in terms of manpower, that kind of strategy can't work. And Ukraine has to adopt a new approach here. And the United States does it as well. So far, we're not seeing that. Other than hearing reports that the Ukrainians are focusing more on playing defense right now, we're not seeing the broader shifts in strategy that I think circumstances dictate right now.
Yeah, and that's I would so much like to see that, and really I think that as your recent piece, which we're just about to get to, is talking about it's time for negotiated settlement, something that's going to, if not preserve what they have, at least prevent Russia from continuing to go more. Because if you just keep a blind eye to what's actually going on the ground, you're going to end up probably losing more ground in a minute. And I know with your experience with understanding kind of the Russian mentality of war and how that kind of conflicts with what we see, I want to get to that in a second. But before we do, I want to jump back to something that you wrote about a year ago. In fact, a year ago this month, you said laying the foundation for a settlement of Ukraine. Again, 1 year ago. This was written just after Ukraine had their signature successes, where they recaptured a big chunk of the Kharkiv in the north, and they had forced Russia to leave Kherson City in the east. And at that time, one of the things you wrote there that really stood out to me, you said, but this offers a window of opportunity for the United States to prepare a diplomatic ground for the eventual settlement of the conflict, a window that may get smaller over time if we don't act now. The goal of preparation should be to put Russia on a path toward accepting a limited defeat that protects ours and Ukraine's core security concerns. One part of this effort will be required persuading Ukraine that its only viable path to secure a prosperous future is through negotiated settlement with Russia. Now, that's one thing that, one of the many things that never happened is that not only did we not convince Ukraine that that's their path, not only did we not lay the diplomatic groundwork for an eventual settlement, we just said, yeah, man, let's give them Bradleys and let's give them Challenger tanks and Abrams tanks and Patriot air defense. Let's feed the idea, the belief that you can win. And so what did we gain for that? They lost Bakhmut after sacrificing tens of thousands into one battle alone. And then they launched this horrific attack over a broad section in the summer, which lost, who knows for sure how many, but I bet another 100,000 probably at least. It's probably many hundreds of thousands that they've lost, killed, and probably an equal or higher number of wounded in addition, because they didn't do what you said. Now then, in this current article that you've written, you're saying, again, it's time to find a negotiated settlement. And one of the key things you wrote in this one was, if we want a prosperous Ukraine with a viable path towards liberal governance and European Union membership, we will have to concede that it cannot be a NATO or U.S. ally, and that this neutral Ukraine must have a verifiable limits on the type and quantities of weapons it may hold. If we refuse to agree to those terms, Russia will quite probably turn Ukraine into a dysfunctional wreck, incapable of rebuilding itself, align with the West, or continuing a military threat to Russia. Now, how frustrating was it for you when you wrote that a year ago, and just imagining if they had acted on it then, and now then you're saying this again, and do you see any prospect that they'll listen to you this time?
Well, one of the challenges that any statesman faces is looking ahead into the future and trying to deal with uncertainty about what's going to unfold. So, when you look ahead, you have to make a calculation. How likely is it that if we continue the course we're on, we're going to be in a better position a few months from now than what we are in right now. How likely would that position be to worsen? And it's not an easy thing to do. You know, nobody can see the future clearly. There are all sorts of things that can happen. But my judgment a long time ago was that this war was likely to happen if the United States was not willing to strike a geopolitical compromise with Russia over European security, over the prospect that Ukraine would be a NATO member. That's something that the Russians firmly oppose. They made this very clear for many, many years. And the United States essentially said, no, you know, we are not willing to concede what we regard as a point of principle that Ukraine should not be a part of the NATO alliance. And that, you know, was not the only factor that led to the war, but it was quite a big one. And we've not been willing, I think, to do what General Milley recommended more or less around the same time. Take advantage of the relative momentum that Ukraine has had in the war, the success in the summer and fall of 2022. Use that momentum to strike an advantageous compromise with the Russians. Now, would that require making concessions? Yes, it would, but probably fewer than you would have to make in the future, because the future, in my view, at that time, was not likely to be as rosy for the Ukrainians as it was back then. And I think in retrospect, that judgment proved correct. Now, and what emerging today is much the same thing. You know,
let me show you. Let me show you another clip here, because this gets to the heart of what you're talking about now, what we wouldn't do before because we wanted this certain outcome. Here, about a little over a month ago, is what Biden's saying, why this is why we must give Ukraine money, because of what will happen if we don't. He said,
the entire world is watching. What will the United States do? And think if we don't support Ukraine, what's the rest of the world going to do? What's Japan going to do, which is supporting Ukraine now? What's going to happen in terms of the G7? What's going to happen in terms of our NATO allies? What are they going to do? If we walk away now, it will only embolden other would-be aggressors. So I'm calling on Congress to do something and do the right thing, to stand with the people of Ukraine, stand against the tyranny of Putin, stand for freedom, literally stand for freedom. Let's get this done.
Yeah, let's just get this done. See, here's one of my problems, George, is that, and I think that this was probably applicable a year ago when you wrote that other piece, and it sure seems to be that way now, is that this is Biden is elaborating on our preferred outcome. We want to succeed because if we don't, we think all these bad things are going to happen. So we just want to throw some more cash at this problem. But when you see the reality of it, and I want to ask you in particular, because of your significant background in understanding the Russian mentality, what do you think is going to be, if you had to use your crystal ball and look forward now about whether we're going to do anything, and what happens if we do stick to this and we do get some kind of money? Maybe we won't get 60 billion, but they'll get some amount of it. But what is Russia going to do? What do you think? Where is Putin's position right now? Because a lot of people in the U.S. are saying they're getting some encouragement, because they say, look, yeah, Ukraine didn't roll any further to the east, and they didn't take any ground back. But Russia hasn't moved forward since November of last year either. The line is pretty much frozen right now. So we can keep this war going, you know, in a stalemate for a long time. What do you say to that?
Well, you know, I think it's a fundamental misunderstanding of how the Russians are fighting this war. The Russians are not trying to break through Ukrainian lines right now, as the United States might in its approach to war. You know, we're big on combined arms operations, wars of maneuver, using technology and intelligence to our advantage to break through the enemy. The Russians are fighting a war that is designed to grind down Ukraine's ability to bring forces to the battle. They're exhausting Western stockpiles of weapons and munition. They're exhausting Ukraine's reserves of manpower. And I think they're quite content to continue doing this, because the longer this goes on, the more difficulty Ukraine will have in reconstituting a fighting force even after this war is over, which is something the Russians have their eye on. You know, they talk about three big objectives in this war: preventing Ukraine from joining NATO, making sure that it's a neutral state, number one; demilitarizing Ukraine, number two; and denazifying Ukraine, as they call it, number three. Now, what does that amount to? They want to make sure that either Ukraine and NATO agree formally that Ukraine will not be a member of the NATO alliance, or they want to leave Ukraine in such a state of disrepair that it's not capable of allying with anybody. So that's one. The demilitarization, again, they've been very explicit about this. Either we reach an agreement on qualitative and quantitative caps on what the Ukrainian military can hold, or Russia will demilitarize Ukraine on the battlefield by doing exactly what it's doing. And the third thing is basically a call for regime change. It's basically a call for replacing the Zelensky regime in some way. And again, I think the Russians believe what they're doing on the battlefield is putting such pressure on the Ukrainians, economically, politically, militarily, societally, that eventually Ukraine will simply break.
So now, who do you think has the better opportunity to go long here? And let's look at each side of this for a second. So just before you and I came on the air, we were talking about the prospect for whether the U.S. would actually come up with $61 billion, and you suggested they probably won't come up with quite that much for many political, internal, domestic reasons here, but probably something will come across here. But what we didn't talk about here, and what I want to ask you now is, let's say that it is, and let's say it's even most of it. Let's say it's $50 billion that we eventually, pass, because maybe the Republicans don't want to at least be blamed for anything going wrong. They want it to be somebody else's fault, so they come up with some kind of money. But is that going to be sustained? Can they sustain that? Whether it's air defense missiles, artillery shells, more weapons, more armor, more armored vehicles, all the kind of things you have to sustain a combat when you're talking about in the years. Will we continue to do that? Can we? And on the other half of that equation, can Russia continue to do that? Can he maintain domestic support for a long term where there's bleeding troops and making mothers unhappy and all this? And will their industry continue to support it? Will their economy? Who's got the better chance to go long here?
Well, the short answer is Russia. And I'll explain to you why I think that's the case. Number one, Western support for Ukraine's war effort is not just a matter of political will. It's also a matter of our actual capacity. And that is something that is not a rosy picture. We have drawn down most of the stockpiles that we had available, the reserves of already manufactured weapons and ammunition that were available to provide. We can't continue to draw that down without putting our own security in grave jeopardy. So the cupboard is largely bare there. Now, you manufacture more weapons to provide to Ukraine, yes, but the United States military industry is not capable of doing that very quickly. It is not like World War II, where the president can call up in Detroit and say, "Guess what? You're in the tank building business now." We have a military industry that is struggling to ramp up its manufacturing of artillery shells, for example, that can't possibly provide Ukraine with the Patriot air defense missiles that it needs quickly enough or at great enough scale to contend with what the Russians can bring.
Now, let me ask, I don't know if you know this question right off the top of your head, but in terms of, and I want to look at that for a second, the Patriot interceptor missiles that we provide, or that we have, and that we've given a lot to Ukraine, how many do we have, if you're aware, even in a general inventory, and how fast can we replenish those? Ergo, if we keep giving them to Ukraine at a sustained rate that Russia's been firing, especially in the recent weeks, are we going to deplete our own resources to we might not even have them if we should need them?
Yes. Well, I'm not sure that those figures are publicly available, but what I can say is two things. Number one, the New York Times reported last week that the US government has told Ukraine that we can't continue to give them Patriot interceptor missiles. We just don't have them available. The second thing is CSIS did a report over a year ago that was looking at American inventories of these various weapons and ammunition. And the conclusion was, in almost all of these cases, replenishing the stockpiles that we had drawn down at that time would take many, many years, 5, 8, 10 years, just to replenish what we had. So,
that was a year ago.
Yeah, this is not a rosy picture at all. Now, the Russians at the beginning of this war, according to the US intelligence community, were manufacturing about 1 million artillery shells a year. Now, they have stepped up that manufacture by many multiples, at least 3 times.
Really?
Right. So the United States, by contrast, we were making somewhere under 200,000 artillery shells a year. We're struggling to double that, all right, by 2025.
25.
Yeah, right. So part of what the Biden administration is trying to do is sort of freeze the war in place, turn this into a stalemate for the next year. Why? Partly for political reasons, so that it can get through the election and not have to make any potentially difficult decisions in the war. But partly we're trying to buy time to ramp up our own manufacturing so that we can generate greater numbers of artillery shells, for example. But even according to our plans, were we to achieve what we've laid out for ourselves, we're still producing only a fraction of what the Russians are manufacturing now. And on top of that, the Russians have a superpower backing them when it comes to artillery. And I'm using that word advisedly. The North Koreans, they're a country that we generally scoff at. They're a basket case. Look how desperate the Russians are. They're relying on the North Koreans for help. Well, when it comes to artillery shells and artillery manufacturing, the North Koreans are a world power. They greatly outproduce what our European allies produce, for example. So the Russians have enormous advantages when it comes to their ability to sustain the production of arms and ammunition. Now, on top
George,
of
let me ask you on a related there. Now, I know the European Union or Europe in large is also trying to match, increasing that we have. And they had promised 1 million shells by this spring, which they already said they won't hit. But what I haven't heard is the caliber of those. Are those Western made, i.e. 155 millimeter, 105 millimeters? And because my understanding is that still the majority of the artillery tubes on the Ukraine side is from the Soviet era, i.e. 152 millimeter. You can't just use that. So is anyone making more of those? Because I don't see how they can sustain the 152 use, and they don't have enough 155 tubes, I don't think, to be able to keep track with the Russians. Am I off base there?
No, I think that's exactly right. The Ukrainians have a decided artillery disadvantage. It's not going to get better over time. In all likelihood, it will get worse. And this has become an artillery war. Largely, that's what's going on. The Russians are using massive artillery barrages to eliminate men and equipment on the Ukrainian side, and there's no indication that I can see that they're not going to be able to sustain that for a long time to come. And that is also an advantage politically, because the Russians don't have to rely on enormous numbers of men. It's not like they're using human wave tactics. They are using artillery where they have a great advantage. They've been able to fire from protected positions. They've got, as you mentioned earlier, extensive defensive fortifications that the Ukrainians can't really penetrate. The Ukrainians are under political pressure to show that they can make progress in the war, and the Russians are turning that to their advantage because they can make a great deal of progress in wearing down the Ukrainians and exhausting their own war capacities and all of this.
Now so going back again to your experience and understanding of the Russian mentality and their way of war, which is different than our way of war, because we're thinking in Desert Storm top, World War II style, breaking through with the big armored fist and having these big arrow movements, etc. And the Russians don't seem to be doing that. Because we haven't seen any big arrow movements from Russia, the idea is, well, they can't do it, so they can never win. Is that a good bet? And what happens if we don't do what you suggested in this recent article to seek a negotiated settlement to try to literally bring this to an end? What if we don't do that and we said, no, we're still going to have belief. We're still going to, give them as much cash as we can, and we won't surrender. We won't do any negotiating. What's going to happen over the next 6 to 12 months from Russia's perspective?
Right. Well, best I can tell, the Russians aren't trying to break through Ukraine right now. It's not like they're doing their best to break through the Ukrainian lines and are experiencing great frustration in their ability to break through. I think the Russians right now are content to grind down Ukraine's war capacity, and they're doing that quite effectively. So if you look at the maps and compare how the battle lines have moved, it gives a misleading impression about what's going on in the war. You have to look at how effective are the Russians right now at wearing down Ukraine's war capacity. From that perspective, I think the Russians are clearly winning, and their advantages are going to grow over time, not diminish. There will come a point where Ukraine, simply collapses, and then the Russians can make rather significant advances on the map. But once that happens, the West and Ukraine will have lost an enormous amount of negotiating leverage, and our ability to strike a compromise in which some of our key interests are protected diminishes. So what will happen if we continue on this course, I think, will be that Russia will increasingly be in a position where it can dictate the terms of a settlement, not negotiate the terms of a settlement. I think that's very much not in our interest to be in. Neither for Ukraine, obviously, which is going to bear the brunt of the damage in all of this, but also for the United States and the West more generally. Very much not in our interest for that kind of scenario to unfold, and that's the danger that we're facing.
And George, you talked about the political a minute ago, and you've referenced the November election coming up for the Biden administration and how they want to basically just get this off the front page and just kind of hold pattern. But can you imagine if they don't do this? And the issue about an army collapse, and we've had some people on to talk about that in the past, it's not a science by any stretch, and who knows when an army is going to break, because the will to fight and to win by the Ukrainians, who knows how long it could go. It could go a long way, but it could also just snap in a minute somewhere, and it's impossible to tell until it does. And once a break happens, psychologically in military history, it can just have a cascading effect and just roll through the force. And all of a sudden, in a minute, you've lost all negotiating possibilities. And can you imagine for the Biden administration then, in that event, anytime between now and November, trying to manage that of an outright loss? I mean, you talk about the options now for the Biden administration. Surely there's got to be people up there that are telling him, you run a tremendous risk of trying to push this off until after November, because you might not get to November. As bad as it would be now to be politically to have a negotiated settlement, I mean, there's ways to do this, isn't there? That the way could make it, put lipstick on a pig, right? I mean, it could possibly minimize the damage.
Well, that's right, and our ability to spin this will diminish over time as the Russians make more and more progress. And yeah, I think you're right. No one can know when a breaking point is going to be reached in advance. It's just, there are too many factors, too many variables to have much certainty. But what you can do is take a look at the dynamics that are at work and judge whether there is some risk that might occur. And I think right now there is, and that risk is growing. Now, do I think that the Russians are going to take all of Ukraine? Let's say Ukraine does break altogether, a real collapse. Would the Russians march to the Polish border? I doubt it. Would they be capable of doing that? Well, maybe.
Yeah,
but
if there's a military collapse, it'll be probably physically possible.
Physically possible, yes.
But correct me if I'm wrong, but Russia would have to basically garrison the entire country with
That's right.
A million people, maybe
govern
a hostile country.
A hostile country. That's right. They would need a military occupation force many times the size of their current invasion force. They would have to sustain it for many, many years, if not decades, in a situation where the United States and NATO would be highly incentivized to encourage, sabotage and guerrilla activities and all sorts of things. It would be an enormous, expensive headache for the Russians. I don't think they want it. What they would probably do is advance their lines to a point where they have said, okay, we've basically got territory which has historically and culturally been Russian, and we're going to create some sort of buffer zone between that territory and the remainder of Ukraine, build our fortified defenses, and then say, okay, the rest of Ukraine is your problem, Europe and the United States, good luck with it. And, that would be, from Russia's point of view, a pretty clear victory.
And George, in the last few minutes we have here, I want you to address one other thing that I hear all the time is reasons why we have to go through. You see it recently with the Germans are saying we might be invaded. We have to get ready. You have the Swiss telling their people and scaring their kids, according to something I read this morning, that Russia could be rolling up on them the next day. Do you see any risk that Russia could say, man, look how good we did here, let's keep going?
Well, very, very unlikely. The Russians have certainly had their hands full capturing territory on their immediate border, territory that has historically been Russian, that they're intimately familiar with, where they have, short supply lines, very, very capable intelligence. The notion that they could then attack a NATO ally with much longer supply lines and much less familiar, much less favorable conditions is really stretches the imagination. I just don't think they would be capable of that, even if they wanted to, and I doubt they want to. Right. Why? What is in it for them to do that? I don't think they'll even take all of Ukraine.
Yeah,
they don't want
nuclear missiles. I mean, it would almost certainly go nuclear. I don't see any chance that NATO would allow itself to be conventionally attacked and not go NATO. And Russia knows that, and they don't want to invite nuclear weapons on their soil. So,
and one of the reasons why the Russians have opted for an attrition strategy in Ukraine is precisely because it minimizes the likelihood of a direct clash with the United States and NATO. They don't want that. They're trying to fight a war in a way that allows them to win while minimizing the risks of a direct war with NATO. So I just no likelihood that they're going to continue, were they to win in Ukraine. Now, there's one possible exception to that, and that would be related to Belarus and Kaliningrad. Kaliningrad is a Russian exclave. They don't have a land connection to it. Lithuania has threatened to deny overland supply. The Russians might feel some need to demand some land corridor to Kaliningrad under the circumstances. My guess is that they might, marshal forces in such a way to put an exclamation point on their desire to resolve that issue that would then create a lot of pressure on the West to find some sort of accommodation. That could be a flashpoint. But I don't think that, a general invasion of the Baltic states or Poland.
I mean, they don't even have the force structure for that. I mean, they don't have the air power, the artillery, the logistics maybe is even more important than all of those. You can't project power that far. You just don't have the capacity.
The Russian people want this war to end, quite honestly. They don't want to lose, but they want to get back to what they call a normal life. I think that's clear.
And that's something I'd like for all of us to get to. Well, George, listen, thank you so much for your time today. This has been a really enlightening show here. And Boy, for anybody who wants to know any more about what George has written here, he's got the Russia Trap, which talks about avoiding a nuclear catastrophe that you wrote a few years back. I highly recommend that. That's very interesting reading there, and hopefully that does not prove prescient as well, like some of your other stuff has. But thank you so much for being on today. And folks, listen, we got more great stuff like this coming. We got John Mearsheimer tomorrow. We got Colonel Doug McGregor tomorrow, which are going to give you even more insight into what is going on the ground here. And we are going to remain unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you the information you need, stuff that you're not going to get from any other channel, because we give you the deep dive and the truth. Thanks, and we will see you next time on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.